Imagine starting a new school year filled with dreams and ambitions, only to find yourself facing an unexpected adversary. A teacher who's supposed to guide and inspire, but instead singles you out, challenges your worth, every day feel like a struggle. This is the story of Ezra, a dedicated student with big dreams of becoming a doctor, who finds himself unfairly targeted by a teacher with hidden biases. As the tension builds, Ezra must decide whether to stay silent or stand up, risking everything to fight for the respect and fairness he deserves. With friends by his side and a determination that won't falter, Ezra's journey reveals the power of courage, resilience, and the profound impact that one voice can have in bringing about real change. Before we dive in, drop a comment below and tell us where you're tuning in from. If this story resonates with you, make sure to hit subscribe so you never miss more inspiring and unforgettable stories like this one. Ezra stood just outside the towering iron gates of Fairview Academy, a school renowned for its challenging academics and competitive student body. It was the beginning of his junior year, and the warm morning sun seemed to highlight his optimism for the year ahead. Ezra dreamed of becoming a doctor, an ambition he had nurtured since childhood. This year felt like a pivotal step toward that goal, and he intended to make the most of it. Taking a deep breath, Ezra adjusted the straps of his backpack and steadied himself. He had always been a hard worker, pouring countless hours into studying and helping his mom around their small home. Their family wasn't well off, and Ezra was acutely aware of the sacrifices his mother made to keep him enrolled at Fairview. She always reminded him that education was the key to a better life, and he held tightly to that belief. Even without material wealth, they shared a deep pride in Ezra's academic achievements, especially since he was among the top students in his class. Fairview Academy was a distinguished institution known for producing future leaders in medicine, law, and business. Ezra often pictured himself following that path, contributing something meaningful to the world. To him, it felt like he was on the right track. His classmates respected him not only for his intelligence, but also for his kindness, even if he wasn't the most outgoing person. Ezra found fulfillment in focusing on his studies and lending a hand to those who needed it. As he walked through the buzzing hallways, he felt an overwhelming sense of purpose for the year ahead. He was determined to excel even further this semester, to impress his teachers, ace every class, and build a strong foundation for his college applications. Ezra's fascination with medicine stemmed from hours spent poring over biology and chemistry books, hoping that one day he'd be able to use his knowledge to help others. The natural sciences intrigued him, especially the complex ways in which the human body functioned. Teachers at Fairview held high expectations for him, but he embraced the challenge and felt motivated to keep pushing forward. This year, he planned to make every effort to surpass even his own expectations. His dedication and discipline were a source of pride, and he wanted his teachers to know how serious he was about his future. Arriving at his first class of the day, history, Ezra was eager to begin. History had always held a special appeal for him, particularly because it allowed him to understand different cultures and how past events had shaped the present. He loved the way history connected time periods and people, painting a bigger picture of society. This year, he looked forward to diving deeper into world events and learning more about the ideas and struggles that had driven humanity. Ezra believed that understanding the past was essential for anyone who wanted to make a real difference in the future, especially in fields like medicine that dealt with people's lives and well-being. However, as Ezra stepped into the classroom, he noticed an unusual silence among the students, who were seated at their desks, uncharacteristically quiet and stiff. The usual cheerful atmosphere had been replaced with an odd tension that seemed to ripple through the room. His initial excitement began to wane, replaced by a subtle sense of discomfort. He glanced around and noticed some of his classmates exchanging uneasy looks with one another. Though he couldn't place it, something felt off. Trying to shake off the feeling, Ezra made his way to his seat near the middle of the room, preparing himself for another exciting year of learning. But as he looked around once more, He couldn't shake the sense that this year might hold more challenges than he had anticipated. The school was known for its tough standards, and he had faced difficult teachers before. But this atmosphere was new. Ignoring his unease, he opened his notebook and reminded himself to stay focused. He was here to learn, after all, and nothing would get in the way of his dreams. Bookmark, go back. Settling into his seat, Ezra looked around the quiet classroom, still unable to ignore the strange tension in the air. He'd never seen his classmates so quiet, each one sitting with their backs straight and eyes forward, almost as if they were waiting for something or someone. As he glanced around, he caught glimpses of nervous smiles and hesitant whispers that quickly died away when the door swung open. Ezra turned to see a woman stride into the room. She had a commanding presence, tall and stern, with sharp, dark eyes that swept across the class as though assessing each student in a single piercing glance. She wore a fitted blazer that only added to her intimidating aura, and her expression was devoid of any warmth or friendliness. There were no welcoming words or introductory remarks. Instead, her gaze remained cold and calculating as she surveyed the class. Ezra felt an instinctual urge to sit up straighter, matching the posture of the other students. The woman walked to the front of the room, heels clicking sharply against the floor with every step, and set down a heavy pile of papers. She didn't need to introduce herself. Her mere presence commanded attention. But after a pause, she finally spoke. "Good morning, class. I'm Miss Stanton," she announced, her tone crisp and unyielding. "I'm your new history teacher. I expect discipline, punctuality, and full effort in this class. I do not tolerate excuses or distractions. In this room, there will be no leniency and no second chances." Ezra's enthusiasm for history dimmed a little. Miss Stanton's severe tone and lack of encouragement made her seem less like a teacher who inspired learning and more like a drill sergeant enforcing a strict code. He felt a subtle but uncomfortable weight pressing down on him as she laid out her expectations. The rules themselves weren't anything out of the ordinary. Students were expected to be attentive, to turn in their work on time, and to meet her high standards. But something about her delivery made it clear that Miss Stanton would not tolerate even the smallest deviation. As Miss Stanton continued her lecture, Ezra couldn't help but notice that her eyes lingered on him longer than on anyone else. Every time she spoke about discipline, the corners of her mouth would tighten and her gaze would flicker in his direction. Ezra tried to brush it off as a coincidence, but the feeling of being singled out persisted. With every passing minute, Miss Stanton's authoritative tone set a clearer picture of her classroom environment. Her words were sharp, delivered with a steely precision that left no room for doubt. She emphasized her zero-tolerance policy for lackluster performance, warning that students who didn't keep up would face severe consequences. Ezra shifted slightly in his seat, sensing her intense gaze on him yet again. Was she expecting him to falter? He'd always excelled in his classes, but the way Miss Stanton looked at him made him feel as if she was waiting for him to make a mistake. The rest of the class seemed to feel the same unease. Ezra noticed the tense shoulders, the anxious glances exchanged between classmates, and the rigid postures as everyone tried to stay on their best behavior. It was a stark contrast to the usual comfort he felt in other classes, where teachers encouraged curiosity and discussion. Miss Stanton's approach felt more like a test of endurance than a learning experience. Ezra took a slow breath, resolving to stay focused. He had faced challenging teachers before and knew how to handle high expectations. Besides, he reminded himself he wasn't here to be liked by every teacher. He was here to learn, grow, and work toward his dream of becoming a doctor. If he had to put up with Miss Stanton's tough approach, he would, no matter how uncomfortable it made him. But, as he closed his notebook at the end of the class, he couldn't ignore the sense that something about Miss Stanton's attention toward him was off. This wasn't just a teacher demanding excellence. There was an edge to her words, a coldness in her gaze that he hadn't encountered before. Ezra hoped he was imagining it, but deep down, he feared he was in for a far tougher year than he'd planned. Bookmark. The next day, Ezra arrived in history class with a cautious sense of determination. Miss Stanton's strictness had unnerved him, but he reminded himself to keep his head down and focus on his work. However, as he entered the classroom, the unease from yesterday lingered. The same oppressive silence hung in the air, as if Miss Stanton's intensity had seeped into the very walls. Miss Stanton strode into the room without a glance at anyone, carrying herself with the same rigid demeanor as before. Without introductions or pleasantries, she immediately launched into her lecture. Her voice was clipped and precise as she outlined more classroom expectations, reiterating her no-tolerance policy for tardiness, missed assignments, or anything less than complete focus. Ezra listened attentively, but her words seemed aimed directly at him, especially whenever she spoke about discipline and poor performance. Some students, she began, letting her gaze linger on Ezra longer than necessary, seem to think they can coast by. But let me make it clear, if you're here to waste my time or anyone else's, this is not the class for you. A chill ran through Ezra as her sharp eyes met his for a brief moment, piercing and unkind. He was an excellent student and had always prided himself on his dedication, but the way she looked at him with a cold, almost predatory gaze made him feel exposed, as though she'd already decided he wasn't good enough for her standards. Trying to ignore the unsettling feeling, Ezra took notes, determined to focus. But as Miss Stanton continued, she glanced his way repeatedly, especially when mentioning discipline issues or students who don't meet expectations. Ezra could feel his heart pound, aware that she seemed to be sizing him up, though he couldn't understand why. Throughout the lecture, Ezra noticed his classmates seemed equally tense, shifting uncomfortably in their seats or casting wary glances at Miss Stanton. Her approach felt like a constant warning. When she spoke, there was no encouragement or passion for the subject, only harsh reminders of her rules and an insistence on unwavering control. She spoke of the importance of hard work and dedication, but her words lacked the warmth that might have inspired her students. Ezra couldn't help but wonder why Miss Stanton had become a teacher if she didn't seem interested in engaging with students beyond enforcing rules. Was this how she ran every class? He felt an odd frustration build up inside him. History had always been one of his favorite subjects, something he looked forward to each year. Yet, under her stern gaze, his excitement began to dull. Halfway through the class, Miss Stanton paused and fixed her gaze directly on Ezra. "Ezra," she said coolly, "what are your thoughts on the role of government in shaping history?" Caught off guard, Ezra cleared his throat, gathering his thoughts before answering. "I think government actions often reflect and influence the culture and values of the time," he said, his voice steady despite his nerves. "Decisions made by leaders impact society on every level, changing how people live and how they see the world." Miss Stanton gave a brief, dismissive nod. "Interesting, but I would expect a more nuanced answer in the future. Don't just state the obvious," she said, her tone carrying a hint of sarcasm. Ezra's confidence faltered. He had thought his answer was thoughtful, but Miss Stanton seemed determined to find fault in his response. Around him, his classmates cast him sympathetic glances, sensing the tension but remaining silent. Ezra forced himself to focus on taking notes, though the sting of her comment lingered. As the bell rang, Miss Stanton's final words were still etched in his mind. Her cold dismissal of his answer left him feeling smaller, as though he'd failed somehow. He promised himself he'd work harder, yet deep down, he couldn't shake the feeling that no matter how much effort he put in, Miss Stanton might never see him as anything more than a student beneath her expectations. As the days passed, Ezra found himself spending more time on history than any other subject. He reviewed each lesson thoroughly, wanting to prove his dedication and avoid giving Miss Stanton any reason to call him out. Yet despite his hard work, he couldn't shake the sense that her gaze was always focused on him, watching for any slip-up. She rarely acknowledged his contributions in class, and when she did, her responses were often curt, as if his answers were somehow insufficient. One morning, Miss Stanton announced a group project focused on pivotal historical movements. Ezra was paired with two of his classmates, Lucas and Zara. They quickly divided the tasks, and Ezra took his portion seriously, researching extensively and preparing a detailed summary. By the end of the week, he had finished early and sent his work to the group, hoping to make a strong impression. When the day of the presentation arrived, Ezra felt prepared. The group took turns presenting, and Ezra spoke confidently, explaining his section with clarity. But when they finished, Miss Stanton's reaction was as sharp as ever. She barely acknowledged Ezra's contributions, instead praising Lucas and Zara for their efforts. Then, with a thin, tight-lipped smile, she turned to Ezra. "I couldn't help but notice you let your group do most of the heavy lifting," she said, her voice dripping with condescension. "If you want to succeed here, you'll need to be more proactive. Passivity won't get you very far." Ezra's heart sank. He had completed his share on time and with care, just like everyone else. The implication that he had contributed less than his peers was not only unfair, but entirely untrue. Around him, some of his classmates exchanged uncomfortable glances, sensing the injustice. Ezra bit back his frustration, determined not to let her words affect him. He'd done his part, and he knew it. But Miss Stanton's critique stung. Her words echoed in his mind long after the class had ended, and he couldn't shake the sense of frustration and confusion. He had always prided himself on his diligence and on never taking shortcuts, and yet here he was, criticized for something he hadn't done. As he replayed her comments in his mind, he began to wonder if she was simply waiting for him to fail. The next few days only seemed to confirm his suspicions. During class discussions, Miss Stanton would frequently cut him off, dismissing his answers before he could fully explain his point of view. When he raised his hand, her gaze would flicker past him as though he wasn't there. He found himself second-guessing every response, carefully weighing his words, worried that she would find something wrong with whatever he said. It wasn't just the verbal exchanges that hurt. Miss Stanton's feedback on his assignments was harsher than he had ever received from any other teacher. Instead of constructive advice, her comments were vague or nitpicky, giving him no clear path to improve. When he asked her for guidance, she simply responded with a thinly veiled impatience, saying he needed to put in more effort if he wanted to meet her standards. Ezra began to feel trapped. He was used to handling high expectations and challenging coursework, but this was different. It was as though Miss Stanton was determined to undermine him, to chip away at his confidence little by little. His passion for history, once one of his favorite subjects, began to wane under the weight of her constant criticism. Around him, his classmates started to notice as well. When Miss Stanton would single him out, they would exchange sympathetic glances or offer quiet words of encouragement after class. But no one dared speak up directly in front of her, afraid of attracting her scrutiny. For the first time in his academic life, Ezra felt a sense of helplessness creeping in. No matter how much effort he put in, he feared that Miss Stanton would continue to find fault, casting him in a shadow of doubt he hadn't known before. As the semester progressed, Miss Stanton's treatment of Ezra grew colder and more pointed. Despite his attempts to remain positive and work harder, it seemed she had made up her mind about him. In class discussions, she would often interrupt him mid-sentence, cutting him off before he could fully articulate his thoughts. Her tone was sharp, laced with a condescending edge that made his stomach churn every time she called on him. One day, during a lesson on pivotal historical figures, Miss Stanton assigned a writing exercise and instructed each student to share their response with the class. When it was Ezra's turn, he spoke carefully, offering his thoughts on the influence of activists and their impact on society. He felt confident that he had prepared a thoughtful answer, one that showed his understanding of the material. But Miss Stanton barely let him finish before shaking her head with a slight, patronizing smile. "That's a very surface-level answer, Ezra," she said, her voice carrying an unmistakable hint of mockery. "Perhaps if you spent more time studying the material, you'd be able to offer a deeper perspective." Ezra's face burned with embarrassment. He had studied, spending hours preparing for the assignment, and he knew his answer had substance. Yet Miss Stanton's comment made him feel as though all his work had been for nothing. His classmates looked at him with expressions of sympathy, but no one dared speak up. The room was silent, and Miss Stanton moved on without a second glance in his direction. That evening, as he worked on his history assignments, he found himself second-guessing everything he wrote, afraid that Miss Stanton would dismiss his work once again. Her feedback had become so harsh and nitpicky that he struggled to find any value in it, It seemed she was deliberately looking for errors, often criticizing details that seemed inconsequential, or finding fault with points she had previously taught as correct. Ezra's frustration grew with each passing day. He knew he was capable. He had proven himself in every class before this one. Yet Miss Stanton's continuous undermining made him question himself. Even when he did well, she would find a way to frame his efforts as inadequate. When he asked her for specific ways to improve, her responses were vague and dismissive, leaving him feeling more confused than before. The impact of her treatment extended beyond the classroom. Ezra found himself becoming quieter, less willing to raise his hand or share his thoughts in other classes. His confidence, once steady, began to waver as he worried that his efforts would always be viewed as inferior. He started avoiding interactions with Miss Stanton whenever possible, afraid of yet another humiliating comment or cold dismissal. It didn't take long for his classmates to notice the change in him. He had once been an eager student, always ready to engage and contribute, but now he seemed withdrawn, his usual spark dimmed. Some of his friends approached him after class, offering words of support and encouragement, yet they, too, feared becoming targets if they confronted Miss Stanton directly. One afternoon, Miss Stanton returned a graded essay to each student. Ezra had poured his heart into this particular assignment, carefully crafting each argument and meticulously citing his sources. But when he looked down at his paper, he saw a low mark scrawled in red ink, accompanied by a single line of feedback. Poor analysis, needs substantial improvement. No explanation, no constructive advice, just a blunt dismissal of his work. His hands trembled as he looked at the paper. Despite all his efforts, all the hours he'd dedicated to making sure he got every detail right, she had cast aside his work as if it were nothing. The weight of her rejection hit him hard, making him feel invisible and unworthy. The bright ambition that had once fueled him began to flicker, replaced by a lingering sense of dread each time he walked into history class. Ezra had faced tough teachers before, but this was something else entirely. Miss Stanton seemed determined to make him doubt himself, to convince him he wasn't capable. He didn't understand why she was targeting him, but he knew one thing for sure. Every day in her class felt like a battle he was slowly losing. After weeks of increasingly harsh treatment, Ezra decided he couldn't go on like this without some answers. Miss Stanton's relentless criticism was wearing him down, leaving him feeling defeated and second-guessing his abilities. He wanted to understand what he was doing wrong, hoping that maybe, just maybe, there was a way to turn things around. One afternoon, after another stinging remark on an answer he'd given, Ezra gathered his courage. As his classmates filed out of the room, he stayed behind, waiting until the last student had left. His heart pounded as he approached Miss Stanton's desk, his hands clutching his notebook tightly. "Miss Stanton," he began, trying to keep his voice steady. "I was hoping I could speak with you about my performance in your class. I want to know how I can improve and what I can do to meet your expectations." Miss Stanton looked up from her papers, her gaze as unreadable as ever. She didn't answer immediately, letting the silence hang uncomfortably in the air. Finally, she set down her pen and folded her hands, fixing her cold stare directly on him. "Improve?" she repeated, a hint of sarcasm in her tone. "Ezra, it's not just about improvement. It's about recognizing your limitations and knowing your place. This class requires a level of insight and dedication that not everyone can handle. Frankly, I'm not sure if you belong here." Ezra felt a lump form in his throat, her words cutting deep. He had always been a top student, praised by his teachers for his hard work and potential. But Miss Stanton was treating him like he was somehow incapable, like he was out of his depth just for being in her classroom. "I've been working hard," he replied quietly, struggling to keep his voice calm. "I care about this class, and I want to do well. I just need to know what I'm doing wrong." Miss Stanton raised an eyebrow, her expression growing colder. "Some things can't be taught, Ezra. Talent insight comes naturally to some students and others, well, they struggle. My advice to you? Perhaps you should focus on areas where your strengths truly lie rather than attempting to succeed in something that may not be suited for you." Her words hung in the air, heavy and unkind. Ezra's hands clenched involuntarily. The implication was clear. She didn't see him as capable. and didn't believe he was fit for her class. She wasn't giving him constructive criticism. She was putting him down and making him feel small and inadequate. Unable to meet her gaze any longer, he looked down, staring at his notebook. He had expected criticism, maybe some tough advice, but this was different. Miss Stanton wasn't interested in helping him improve. She seemed determined to make him doubt himself, to make him feel as though he didn't belong. With a quiet, "Thank you," Ezra turned and left the room, his chest heavy with disappointment. As he walked down the empty hallway, her words echoed in his mind, each one a reminder of her disdain. It wasn't just her critique of his work that stung, it was the way she had looked at him, as though he were beneath her, as though his efforts were futile. By the time he reached his locker, Ezra's initial hope had faded, replaced by a dull ache of frustration and sadness. Miss Stanton wasn't simply a tough teacher. She was someone who seemed determined to undermine him, to make him question his worth. He had never encountered this level of hostility from an authority figure before, and he didn't know how to handle it. For the first time, Ezra wondered if his dream of succeeding in this class, of pursuing a career in medicine, might be slipping away. He'd worked hard and always believed that with enough effort he could achieve his goals. But Miss Stanton's words had planted a seed of doubt, one that threatened to grow with each passing day. Ezra couldn't shake Miss Stanton's harsh words. That evening, as he sat at his desk trying to study, her dismissive tone and the cold look in her eyes kept replaying in his mind. No matter how hard he tried to focus on his notes, he found himself drifting back to the encounter, the sting of her comments lingering like a bruise. It wasn't just that she had questioned his abilities, it was something deeper, something he hadn't been willing to acknowledge until now. Her words hadn't been aimed at helping him grow or improve, they'd been designed to make him feel out of place, unworthy. And the more he thought about it, the more he began to see a pattern. The way she never called on him unless it was to criticize, the way she dismissed his ideas while encouraging others, and the subtle yet cutting remarks that hinted he didn't belong. At first, he had chalked it up to her being strict, maybe even overly critical. But as he thought back over the weeks, a troubling realization began to dawn on him. Miss Stanton wasn't just tough on him, she was targeting him. And painfully, Ezra started to wonder if it was because of something beyond his control. The color of his skin. He'd read about discrimination in history books, heard stories from older relatives, and even had brief discussions on the topic in class. But he'd never imagined he would experience it firsthand, especially in a place like Fairview Academy, which prided itself on diversity and inclusivity. The idea that his teacher, someone meant to guide and support him, could be treating him differently because of his race felt surreal and deeply painful. The weight of this realization pressed down on him, making it hard to breathe. He had always believed that if he worked hard enough, he could achieve anything, that his success would be based on his abilities and determination. But now, it seemed that Miss Stanton had already decided who he was and what he was capable of, long before he'd had the chance to prove himself. As days went by, Ezra began noticing small details he had once overlooked, signs he'd been reluctant to acknowledge. When he raised his hand, Miss Stanton would glance his way, only to look past him and call on someone else. If he asked a question, her response would be curt and dismissive, often leaving him with more confusion than before. Meanwhile, she would take extra time to explain things to other students, offering warm smiles and encouragement that were glaringly absent in her interactions with him. This pattern became undeniable, and Ezra felt a mix of frustration, sadness, and even anger. He had worked so hard to get to where he had overcome so many challenges, only to be met with this level of unfairness. It was like running a race where someone kept moving the finish line just out of reach. For the first time, Ezra felt helpless. How could he fight something he couldn't fully see, something that was disguised as criticism and high expectations? And even if he could, who would believe him? Miss Stanton was respected at the school, known for her strict standards, but also for getting results. She was trusted, while he was just a student, someone she could dismiss with a cold glance and a few words. The next morning, Ezra looked at himself in the mirror, feeling the weight of his new understanding. His excitement for the school year had faded, replaced with a heavy dread he carried with him each day. He wanted to believe it wasn't true, that he was misreading the situation. But the evidence was there, clear as day. And now, he couldn't unsee it. He took a deep breath, trying to find strength in himself. He wouldn't let Miss Stanton's treatment define him. Even if she saw him as less, even if she never gave him the chance he deserved, he would hold on to the belief that he was capable, that he belonged. But beneath that resolve lay a simmering pain that refused to fade, a reminder that sometimes hard work and talent weren't enough to shield him from prejudice. The growing sense of isolation and frustration weighed heavily on Ezra, and after another week of dismissive comments and cold stares from Miss Stanton, he decided he couldn't keep carrying it alone. He needed someone to listen, someone to help him navigate the confusion and unfairness. Reluctantly, he decided to visit Mr. Peterson, the school's guidance counselor. Mr. Peterson was known for his supportive and understanding nature, and Ezra hoped he might be able to help him make sense of Miss Stanton's behavior. After school, Ezra found his way to the quiet hallway that led to Mr. Peterson's office. Taking a deep breath, he knocked gently on the door, his heart racing as he considered how to explain everything. Mr. Peterson's calm voice called him in, and Ezra entered, taking a seat across from the counselor's desk. "Ezra, good to see you," Mr. Peterson greeted him with a warm smile. "What brings you here today?" Ezra hesitated for a moment, gathering his thoughts. "I need to talk to you about something that's been going on in my history class," he began, his voice low but steady. "It's about Miss Stanton. I think she's been treating me differently." Mr. Peterson's smile faded slightly, replaced by a look of concern. "Differently? In what way?" Ezra took a deep breath, choosing his words carefully as he recounted the series of dismissive comments, unfair critiques, and harsh feedback that had begun to feel targeted. He told Mr. Peterson about how Miss Stanton would ignore his questions, critique him more severely than his classmates, and offer only vague, unhelpful advice when he sought ways to improve. "And it's not just that she's strict," Ezra added, his voice growing more determined. "It feels like it's personal. Like she doesn't believe I belong in her class. I'm not sure why, but it's affecting me. I'm starting to lose confidence, and I don't know what to do." Mr. Peterson listened intently, nodding occasionally. But as Ezra spoke, he noticed a flicker of hesitation in the counselor's eyes, a slight shift in his expression that made him feel uneasy. When Ezra finished, Mr. Peterson leaned back in his chair, his hands folded thoughtfully. "Ezra," he began slowly, "I understand that this situation must be difficult for you. Miss Stanton is known for being demanding with her students. Some would even say she has high standards that not everyone can meet." Ezra felt a pang of disappointment, sensing where this conversation was headed. "I know she's demanding," he replied, trying to keep his voice steady. "But this is different. It's not just about being strict. She's making it personal, and it's affecting my confidence. I feel like she's targeting me, like she's trying to make me feel small." Mr. Peterson sighed, his expression sympathetic but cautious. "I don't want to dismiss your feelings, Ezra. It's clear that you're struggling, and I'm sorry you're going through this. However, Miss Stanton is highly respected by the faculty. She's been with the school for a long time and has a reputation for pushing her students to excel." Ezra's frustration grew. "So, because she's respected, I'm just supposed to ignore what's happening?" he asked, a trace of disbelief in his voice. "She's singling me out. I'm doing everything I can to keep up, but it's like no matter what I do, she's already made up her mind about me." Mr. Peterson hesitated again, glancing at the stack of papers on his desk before looking back at Ezra. "I understand, Ezra. I'll make a note of your concerns, and I'll keep an eye on the situation. But in the meantime, I encourage you to stay focused on your studies. Try not to let this distract you. Sometimes, the best way to handle these challenges is to rise above them." Ezra's heart sank. He had come here seeking support, someone to stand up for him. But Mr. Peterson's words felt more like a gentle dismissal. Rising above wasn't the solution he'd hoped for, not when he felt so undermined each day in class. With a quiet, "Thank you for your time," he rose from his seat and left the office, the door closing softly behind him. As he walked down the hallway, a wave of helplessness washed over him. He had tried to do the right thing to seek guidance, but it felt as though he'd been left alone to deal with Miss Stanton's unfairness. And now, even the small spark of hope he'd had felt dimmer than ever. Despite Mr. Peterson's well-intentioned advice, Ezra felt more isolated than ever. The cycle of belittling remarks, harsh critiques, and subtle dismissals continued, and the toll it took on his confidence grew heavier with each passing day. He forced himself to study, to prepare for class, but his initial drive was fading. Miss Stanton's words and stares seemed to erode his efforts, making him feel as though all his work was pointless. One morning, Stanton announced that students would be presenting their research on key civil rights movements. Ezra had been assigned the Montgomery bus boycott, a topic he felt especially passionate about. He admired the courage and determination of individuals like Rosa Parks, who had fought against injustice despite overwhelming odds. Preparing for this presentation had rekindled a bit of his old enthusiasm, and he poured his energy into crafting a meaningful, well-researched presentation. When the day arrived, Ezra walked to the front of the classroom, his notes in hand. He took a deep breath, reminding himself of the hours he'd put into this project. He began his presentation with confidence, explaining the significance of the Montgomery bus boycott and how it had marked a turning point in the fight for civil rights. But just as he was gaining momentum, Miss Stanton interrupted him, her voice sharp and condescending. "Ezra, are you sure about those statistics? They don't sound quite accurate." Ezra blinked, momentarily thrown off by the unexpected interruption. "Yes, Miss Stanton, I double-checked my sources. The boycott lasted 381 days, leading to a Supreme Court decision that desegregated public buses." Miss Stanton crossed her arms, her mouth twisting into a slight smirk. "It seems like you're just repeating information without fully understanding it," she said, her tone dripping with condescension. "Did you even verify the credibility of your sources, or are you just parroting what you read?" A cold silence settled over the room. Ezra's heart pounded as he tried to process her words. He had researched carefully, consulting reputable books and articles written by historians. There was no doubt about the accuracy of his information, yet Miss Stanton's words were meant to undermine him in front of everyone. Before he could respond, Miss Stanton continued. "It's not surprising, really," she said, her voice dismissive. "Some students struggle to grasp the complexities of these issues. Maybe next time you'll be able to present a more nuanced understanding." Ezra's hands trembled as he held his notes. Her words weren't just a critique of his work. They felt like a personal attack, as if she wanted to make sure he felt small. He could feel the weight of his classmates' eyes on him, some filled with sympathy, others with shock. But as he struggled to regain his composure, a voice from the back of the room broke the silence. "Miss Stanton, that was unfair," Sarah, one of his classmates, said firmly. Her face was flushed with a mixture of anger and determination. "Ezra's presentation was good, and he's put in a lot of effort. You didn't need to tear him down like that." Miss Stanton's eyes narrowed, clearly unaccustomed to being challenged. "Excuse me?" she replied, her tone icy. Sarah stood her ground. "You heard me. The way you spoke to him was disrespectful. And it wasn't necessary. And the way you keep singling him out, it's wrong. We can all see it." For a moment, the room was utterly silent, everyone holding their breath. Then, a few other students began nodding, casting looks of agreement and support toward Ezra. Lucas and Priya, students he hadn't spoken to much outside of class, offered quiet words of agreement, while others exchanged murmurs of solidarity. Ezra's heart swelled with a sense of relief and gratitude. For the first time, he didn't feel entirely alone. Miss Stanton's expression darkened, but she didn't respond. She simply moved on, though the tension lingered in the air long after the class ended. As Ezra returned to his seat, he glanced back at Sarah and his classmates, a glimmer of hope rekindling within him. The battle was far from over, but now he knew he wasn't fighting it alone. Bookmark. After Sarah's brave stand in class, Ezra noticed a shift in the atmosphere. Several classmates who had once stayed silent now began to show their support, making it clear they saw the unfair treatment he endured. During lunch and between classes, they would catch up with him, offering encouraging words and sympathizing with his situation. Ezra felt a newfound strength, knowing he wasn't alone in facing Miss Stanton's disdain. One afternoon, Sarah, along with Lucas and Priya, approached Ezra with an idea. They suggested that since Miss Stanton's treatment was often subtle and elusive, gathering evidence might be the only way to prove her pattern of behavior. If they could document her comments and treatment, they could take the information to the school board and force them to take the matter seriously. At first, Ezra hesitated. The idea of recording his teacher felt risky, and he worried about the consequences for his classmates if they got caught. But the look of determination on their faces reassured him. They were willing to stand by him, willing to take risks to expose the truth. The unfairness he felt daily burned within him, and he realized that this might be the only way to bring about change. With a nod, he agreed to their plan. Over the next few days, the group worked together in secret, with Sarah, Lucas, and Priya discreetly documenting Miss Stanton's interactions with Ezra. They sat strategically around the classroom, positioning their phones in ways that wouldn't draw attention, and made sure to take detailed notes on her remarks and their context. Each student who witnessed her mistreatment added to the documentation, creating a timeline of incidents that highlighted her increasingly hostile behavior toward Ezra. Every dismissive comment, every belittling critique, every time she ignored him while favoring other students, they recorded it all. Ezra's friends even began jotting down notes on specific exchanges, backing up his accounts with their own observations. As the evidence grew, so did the number of classmates who wanted to support him. What had started as a small group soon expanded, with more students quietly agreeing to document incidents and offer testimonies. The group's mission became a silent but unified rebellion against Miss Stanton's unjust behavior. One particular recording captured Miss Stanton dismissing Ezra's carefully researched answer as simplistic and uninspired. Her tone, thick with condescension, contrasted sharply with the encouragement she gave other students for far less detailed responses. Another recording revealed her ignoring his raised hand during a discussion, only to call on other students who were offering similar points. These moments, each one small on its own, painted a powerful picture when collected as a whole. In the evenings, they would meet in the school library where they reviewed and organized the recordings and notes. As they played back the audio clips, Ezra felt both anger and relief. Hearing Miss Stanton's words from a distance allowed him to see just how blatantly unfair she had been, and the unity of his classmates gave him the courage he hadn't felt before. Priya leaned in, her expression resolute as they listened to yet another clip of Miss Stanton's scornful remarks. "We have enough now, don't we?" she asked, looking around the table. "This has to be enough." Lucas nodded. "Definitely. No one can ignore this, not even the school board." Ezra felt a wave of gratitude wash over him as he looked at his friends. They had each chosen to risk their own comfort, their own standing, to support him. What had once seemed like an insurmountable problem now felt like a cause they could win together. For the first time in weeks, Ezra felt a spark of hope and strength that Miss Stanton's words had once crushed. With their evidence compiled, the group agreed on their next step, presenting it to the school board. It would be a challenge, and they knew Miss Stanton was a respected teacher. But with the unity of his friends and the undeniable proof they had gathered, Ezra felt ready to take on the fight. Bookmark. The day had come for Ezra and his friends to bring their case to the school board. With recordings, notes, and statements meticulously organized, they felt as prepared as they could be, but Ezra's heart still raced with nervous anticipation. This was his chance to finally be heard, to show the injustice he'd endured. But it was also a huge risk. Miss Stanton was a respected teacher, and he worried about how the board would react. They arrived early at the administration office, clutching the folder containing their evidence. Sarah, Lucas, Priya, and a few other classmates who had volunteered to stand with Ezra joined him, their faces set with determination. Just being surrounded by their support gave him strength, and he took a deep breath, reminding himself of all they had gathered. The school board members welcomed them into a small meeting room where the students took seats opposite the panel of administrators, teachers, and board officials. Among them was Miss Lewis, the board chair, who was known for her fair but firm handling of student concerns. She smiled at them warmly, her presence somewhat easing Ezra's nerves. Miss Lewis began the meeting with a nod. "Thank you for coming today, students. I understand you have some concerns you'd like to bring to our attention." Ezra felt his classmates' eyes on him as he cleared his throat and began explaining how Miss Stanton's treatment of him had impacted his confidence and academic experience. He spoke about her cutting remarks, the dismissive way she treated his contributions, and the clear favoritism she showed toward other students. His voice wavered at times, but he held his ground, determined to convey the seriousness of his experience. As he finished, Sarah took over, detailing how the group had come together to support Ezra and document Miss Stanton's behavior. She carefully presented their collection of notes, recounting instances where Miss Stanton had unfairly criticized Ezra or ignored him while encouraging other students. When she played the recordings, the room fell into a heavy silence as Miss Stanton's voice echoed from the speakers, dripping with condescension and hostility. "This is just a small sample of what we've observed," Sarah said quietly, turning off the recording. "It's been going on for months, and we couldn't stay silent anymore." The board members exchanged glances, some looking visibly disturbed by the recordings and the detailed notes. Ms. Lewis leaned forward, her brow furrowed. "Thank you, Sarah, and thank you all for sharing this. It's clear that you put a lot of effort into documenting these incidents. Ezra, I'm sorry to hear about the difficult experience you've had in Miss Stanton's class." Ezra nodded, feeling a surge of relief at her understanding tone. "Thank you, Miss Lewis. I just want to be treated fairly, like every other student." Ms. Lewis took a long, thoughtful pause before speaking again. "These are serious allegations, and the evidence you've provided is compelling. We will launch an official investigation into Miss Stanton's conduct, but please understand that this process may take some time. I appreciate your courage in bringing this forward, and I promise that we'll look into it thoroughly." As the meeting wrapped up, Ezra felt a cautious sense of hope. He knew there were no guarantees, but the board's response seemed genuine, and Miss Lewis's words of encouragement had meant more to him than she could know. His friends gathered around him as they left the room, their spirits buoyed by the knowledge that they had done all they could. They had been heard. Over the next few days, word of the complaint began to spread through the school. Whispers filled the hallways as students and even some teachers learned about the recordings and the investigation into Miss Stanton's behavior. Some students approached Ezra to offer their support, while others shared stories of their own struggles with unfair treatment in classes. He realized that this wasn't just about him anymore. It was about holding authority figures accountable and making the school a place where everyone felt respected. Though he knew the road ahead would be uncertain, Ezra felt a renewed sense of purpose. He had stood up, spoken out, and finally, people were listening. But as the school board's investigation gained momentum, new details emerged that rippled through the school community. Ezra and his friends were stunned to learn that Miss Stanton wasn't just any teacher. She was the daughter of Principal Harrison. This revelation spread through Fairview Academy like wildfire, casting a new light on the situation and raising questions about how much the principal knew and if he had been shielding his daughter from accountability. For years, Principal Harrison had been known for his strict but fair approach. His reputation as an impartial leader had earned him respect among students and faculty alike. His office had always been seen as a place where serious issues were addressed with fairness and empathy. But now, with Miss Stanton's close connection to him revealed, people began to wonder. Had he known about her behavior? Had he overlooked her actions out of family loyalty? As rumors swirled, Ezra felt conflicted. On one hand, it was a relief to know that the board was taking action. On the other, it was disheartening to consider that Miss Stanton's behavior might have gone unchecked because of her father's influence. If Principal Harrison had indeed known about her treatment of students, it was a betrayal of everything the school supposedly stood for. The pressure on Principal Harrison grew with each passing day. Students, parents, and even teachers began voicing their concerns, some even requesting meetings to discuss how this situation had been allowed to persist. Principal Harrison found himself caught in a difficult position. He was both the school's leader and a father, and those roles now clashed painfully. One morning, Principal Harrison was called to meet with the school board to discuss the findings of the investigation so far. He sat at the large conference table, his normally composed expression clouded with tension. Ms. Lewis, the board chair, sat across from him, a stack of papers in front of her. She didn't mince words. "Principal Harrison, we have substantial evidence pointing to a pattern of discrimination and unfair treatment in Miss Stanton's classroom," she began, her tone serious but controlled. "Multiple students have come forward with corroborating statements, and there's recorded evidence of inappropriate comments directed at Ezra Daniels. This behavior cannot be ignored." Principal Harrison took a deep breath, his hands clasped tightly on the table. "I understand, Miss Lewis, and I am deeply disappointed. I had no idea these issues had escalated to this extent." Miss Lewis's gaze didn't waver. "This is a matter of accountability, Principal Harrison. The students trust us to protect them and provide a safe learning environment. This investigation requires complete transparency, especially given your relationship with Miss Stanton." He nodded slowly, the gravity of the situation weighing heavily on him. He knew the board's expectations were clear. His loyalty to the school and its principals had to come before family. But as a father, the thought of holding his own daughter accountable filled him with dread. Had he been too lenient? Had he allowed his role as a father to cloud his judgment? The days following the meeting were filled with tension. Principal Harrison's silence only fueled more rumors. Parents began reaching out to the school board, demanding answers. Some were sympathetic, understanding the difficulty of his position. But many were outraged. How could they trust an administration that allowed such behavior to go unchecked? For Ezra, this revelation brought mixed feelings. He'd come to Fairview Academy believing it was a place of fairness and opportunity, a school that rewarded hard work and treated all students with respect. But now, he couldn't help but wonder how many other students might have been affected, how many others might have suffered in silence because they feared no one would believe them. As he walked through the halls, he saw the questioning looks of his classmates and the uncertainty that hung in the air. It felt as though everyone was waiting for the next move, waiting to see if justice would be served or if Principal Harrison would protect his daughter. The principal's choice would set a precedent, one that would either affirm Fairview's commitment to its values or shatter the trust of those who had come to believe in it. As the investigation drew closer to a conclusion, Ezra hoped that Principal Harrison would remember his responsibility to the students above all else. Bookmark. As the school board's investigation neared its final stages, the tension at Fairview Academy was palpable. Students whispered in the hallways, teachers exchanged uneasy glances, and parents began calling the administration for updates. The story had spread beyond the school walls, with local news covering the controversy surrounding Miss Stanton and her father, Principal Harrison. Fairview's reputation was on the line, and everyone was watching to see what the board would do. The school board members, including Miss Lewis, grew increasingly aware of the community's demands for accountability. After reviewing the evidence and conducting interviews with both students and faculty, they came to an unavoidable conclusion. Miss Stanton's behavior was unacceptable, and the only question that remained was how Principal Harrison would handle the situation as both a father and the school's leader. In a meeting with the school board, Principal Harrison sat across from Miss Lewis and the other board members, his expression worn and tired. Miss Lewis, calm but unyielding, looked directly at him, her gaze holding a seriousness that left no room for misinterpretation. "Principal Harrison," she began, her tone firm, "this investigation has confirmed a pattern of discriminatory behavior by Miss Stanton. Given her position and your relationship with her, this situation demands a clear and decisive response. The board has done everything possible to ensure fairness, but now we must ask, how do you intend to proceed?" Principal Harrison's face remained impassive, but the inner conflict was evident in his eyes. He had spent his career advocating for fairness and discipline, building a reputation as a no-nonsense leader. But now the demands of justice clashed painfully with his role as a father. He knew the board expected action, and he felt the weight of that expectation pressing down on him. After a long pause, he finally spoke, his voice steady but filled with sorrow. I understand the board's concerns, and I recognize the gravity of the situation. My daughter's actions have compromised her position and brought harm to the students she was meant to support. As her father, this is a painful reality to face, but as principal, I know what must be done. The board members listened in silence as Principal Harrison continued, his voice growing firmer. I will recommend Miss Stanton's immediate dismissal from her teaching position. I understand that this decision will impact my family, but I cannot allow personal ties to undermine the values this school stands for. Fairview has always strived to provide a safe and fair environment for every student, and I intend to uphold that standard, even if it means making this difficult choice. Miss Lewis nodded, her expression softening. Thank you, Principal Harrison. We understand that this is a difficult decision, and we respect your commitment to Fairview's principles. This action, though painful, will help restore the trust and integrity that the students, parents, and faculty expect from this school. With the board's support, the decision was finalized, and within hours, the news was officially released. Miss Stanton would no longer be teaching at Fairview Academy. For Ezra and his classmates, the news felt like a moment of validation, a long-awaited acknowledgement of the unfairness they had endured. As word of Miss Stanton's dismissal spread, students began to approach Ezra with words of encouragement and support. Some even shared their own stories of feeling overlooked or treated unfairly, showing him that his courage in speaking out had helped more people than he realized. But for Principal Harrison, the decision brought no joy. He had upheld his duty, but at a tremendous personal cost. The choice he'd made might restore the school's integrity, but it also fractured his relationship with his daughter, leaving a lasting impact on his family. As the dust began to settle, Fairview Academy took its first steps toward healing. Students and teachers alike felt a renewed sense of hope, a belief that perhaps the school would become a better place, one that honored its commitment to fairness and equality. For Ezra, the knowledge that his voice had made a difference felt like the first step in reclaiming his confidence and renewing his dreams. With the administration's commitment to change, Fairview Academy began to feel like a place where students could once again feel safe and valued. And though the journey had been difficult, Ezra knew that speaking up had been worth it. He had helped to shape a brighter, fairer future, not only for himself, but for everyone at the school. In the weeks following Miss Stanton's dismissal, Fairview Academy underwent a transformation. The administration moved quickly to introduce new policies and procedures aimed at preventing discrimination and ensuring that students' voices would be heard. Anti-bias training was scheduled for all faculty, and Principal Harrison made a public statement emphasizing the school's renewed commitment to a respectful and supportive learning environment for every student. For Ezra, the changes felt surreal. It was strange walking into history class and seeing a different teacher at the front of the room, someone who greeted him with a warm smile and encouraged him to share his ideas. The sense of dread he'd once felt had lifted, replaced by a cautious optimism. His classmates noticed it too. The atmosphere in class was lighter, and students spoke up more freely, no longer afraid of being belittled. The administration also established new channels for reporting concerns. Each student now had access to a private forum where they could report any issues anonymously, and the school counselor, Mr. Peterson, held open-door office hours so students could talk freely about any struggles they were facing. The changes made it clear that the school was taking steps to rebuild trust and prevent future situations like the one Ezra had endured. One afternoon, Ezra was approached by Miss Lewis from the school board. She had come to observe the school's progress and personally thanked Ezra and his friends for their courage in coming forward. In the cafeteria, surrounded by his classmates, Miss Lewis addressed him with a genuine smile. "Ezra, you've shown remarkable strength and integrity," she said. "By speaking up, you helped create meaningful change not only for yourself but for everyone here at Fairview. We're grateful for the example you've set." Ezra nodded, grateful but still a little overwhelmed by the attention. "Thank you, Miss Lewis. It wasn't easy, but knowing that things are changing for the better makes it all worth it." His friends, Sarah, Priya, Lucas, and the others who had supported him, nodded in agreement. They too had played an essential role in bringing Miss Stanton's behavior to light, and the bonds they'd formed during this difficult journey felt stronger than ever. Together, they'd faced the challenge and fought for what was right, and now they were seeing the results of their efforts. With the new policies in place, Fairview Academy felt more united. Teachers who had once turned a blind eye began engaging more with students, and classmates who had been bystanders began to show more empathy and respect. Ezra saw this change in small ways. Classmates who once stayed silent when someone was struggling now stepped in to help, and teachers made a more conscious effort to include every student's voice in discussions. Despite the progress, the experience had left Ezra with scars. He still felt the sting of Miss Stanton's words, her dismissive tone echoing in his mind from time to time. But he was learning to let go of the self-doubt she had instilled in him, replacing it with a renewed belief in his own abilities. His friends remained by his side, reminding him of his strength and encouraging him to focus on his goals. They had been through a challenging ordeal together, and their friendship had deepened as a result. The school's administration even invited Ezra to join a student advisory council, a group formed to ensure that student voices were regularly considered in school policies. Accepting the invitation was an honor Ezra hadn't expected, but it filled him with pride. It was an opportunity to continue the work he'd started, to be a voice for his classmates, and to help create an environment where every student felt valued. As the semester continued, Ezra regained the confidence he had once felt in his studies, and his dreams of becoming a doctor no longer felt out of reach. The sense of purpose he'd fought to protect burned even brighter, and he now had the support of his friends, teachers, and an administration that had proven it was willing to listen and change. Fairview Academy had faced a difficult chapter, one that exposed weaknesses in its foundation. But out of that struggle, the school had come together to create a stronger, more inclusive community. As Ezra looked forward, he felt a powerful sense of fulfillment, knowing that his courage and resilience had helped build a safer, fairer place for future students. As the school year drew to a close, graduation day arrived at last. Ezra could hardly believe how far he'd come, how much he'd overcome since that first tense day in Miss Stanton's history class. Now, standing in his cap and gown, he looked around at his classmates and friends, his heart swelling with pride. They had not only survived a challenging year, but they had also brought about lasting change at Fairview Academy, a change that would help protect students for years to come. The graduation hall was filled with the hum of excited students and proud families. Ezra's mother sat near the front, beaming with pride, her eyes glistening as she watched him prepare to cross the stage. She had always been his biggest supporter, reminding him of his potential and encouraging him to keep going even when things felt impossible. Ezra's success was as much hers as it was his, and he could feel her love and support radiating from her smile. When Ezra's name was called, he took a deep breath and stepped onto the stage. Applause erupted louder than he had expected, and he spotted Sarah, Priya, Lucas, and his other friends cheering for him from the audience. Their voices rose above the crowd, filling him with a deep sense of gratitude. These were the people who had stood by him through it all, who had fought with him when he felt like he couldn't keep going. Their friendship had become one of the most valuable things he'd gained from his time at Fairview. As Ezra shook hands with the new principal, a man who had stepped in during the transition after Principal Harrison's resignation, he felt an unspoken acknowledgement pass between them. The principal's nod seemed to say, "I see you, and I'm proud of what you've accomplished." For Ezra, this small gesture was a symbol of the school's fresh start, its commitment to integrity, and its newfound dedication to listening to students. Standing on stage, diploma in hand, Ezra looked out over the crowd. This diploma represented far more than academic success. It symbolized resilience, courage, and the strength he had found within himself to speak up for what was right. He had faced one of the hardest challenges of his life and had come through it stronger, knowing he was capable of handling whatever might come his way. As he descended the stage and rejoined his friends, Sarah pulled him into a hug, her eyes bright with pride. "We did it, Ezra," she said, her voice filled with emotion. You did it. Ezra smiled, feeling the weight of everything he had accomplished settle into place. We did this together, he replied. I couldn't have done it without you all. They gathered for a group photo, laughing and celebrating, their faces filled with the joy of shared victory. They had become more than classmates. They were a team, a united front that had stood up to injustice and changed the course of their school. As the ceremony concluded, Ezra and his friends joined their families and teachers for a final farewell. The warmth in the room was palpable, a testament to how far Fairview had come in such a short time. The community had rallied around Ezra and his classmates, supporting their courage and ensuring that the values of fairness and respect were woven into the school's fabric. As they walked out of the auditorium, Ezra looked toward the future with hope. He still held his dream of becoming a doctor close to his heart, but now he carried something even more powerful with him, a belief in his own strength and the knowledge that he could make a difference. Graduation was the end of one chapter, but he knew it was only the beginning of a much greater journey. No matter where life would take him, Ezra would remember the lesson he'd learned at Fairview. That even one voice could spark change, and that with the support of those who believe in you, no obstacle is too great. As he walked out into the sunlit day with his friends by his side and his family waiting nearby, Ezra felt a deep sense of peace. He had stood up, spoken out, and ultimately won. And for that, he knew he would always be grateful. This story of Ezra's journey through adversity and his ultimate triumph reminds us of the power of resilience, integrity, and the importance of standing up for what is right. In facing a challenging situation with Miss Stanton, Ezra discovered the strength to confront unfair treatment, supported by friends and a school community that grew stronger and more united through his courage. His journey shows that even when circumstances seem insurmountable, there are those who will stand by you, and that change often begins with just one voice. Through his determination, Ezra helped inspire positive changes in his school, ensuring it became a place where future students could feel safe and valued. This story is a reminder that while the fight for fairness may be difficult, it's a battle worth fighting. Standing up against discrimination, calling for accountability, and embracing empathy for others ultimately leads to a community built on respect and inclusion. If you found this story inspiring, please leave a comment with one. If you thought it was very inspiring, comment 2. We'd also love to hear about your own stories of resilience and standing up for what's right. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss out on more inspiring stories in the future. Share your thoughts about this story in the comments below. We can't wait to hear from you.